Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a question that I find really intriguing. Can you actually inherit trauma? You've given us quite a mix here. Scientific papers, personal stories, even some excerpts on ancient wisdom. It's quite a stack.
It really is almost like we're piecing together a puzzle, where science meets personal experience. And the big question mark hanging over everything is, can our ancestors' experiences actually impact us? I mean, beyond just stories and memories, could they actually leave a mark?
Okay, so let's start with that science angle. One of the papers you gave me mentioned this thing called epigenetics. What exactly is that? How does it fit into all of this?
Well, imagine your DNA as like this massive blueprint, epigenetics. That's like the instruction manual that decides which parts of that blueprint actually get used. It doesn't change the DNA sequence itself. It's more about influencing how those genes express themselves.
So it's like a dimmer switch for our genes then? That's kind of cool. But how does this dimmer switch actually work? I'm curious. What's the mechanism?
One of the key players is methylation. Basically, a methyl group attaches to a gene. And what this can do is physically block the machinery that reads the DNA. It's like flipping a switch to the off position for that gene. And the really mind-blowing part is that sometimes these changes, they can be inherited. They can be passed down.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that like something that happened to my grandmother, something traumatic even, that could actually affect how my genes work today?
That's what some of the research suggests, yeah. One study that really illustrates this is what's known as the Dutch famine study. Researchers looked at people who were exposed to famine during World War II, and they found alterations, changes in the methylation of certain genes. And what's incredible is that these changes were still detectable decades later, even in the children of those who were exposed to the famine while they were in the womb.
So it's like the experience of the famine, it left this biological mark that was passed down to the next generation.
Oh, wow.
It's pretty intense. But what about things that are a bit less extreme, like, say, everyday diet? Can that really affect our genes too?
Absolutely. Diet plays a huge role. There's research showing that specific nutrients, and especially protein intake during pregnancy, can influence methylation patterns in offspring. And we're talking about things that affect stress response, even increase the risk of certain health issues later in life.
Whoa. So our food choices today, they can have this ripple effect. They can reach generations down the line. I mean, that's a lot of responsibility on my plate.
It is. It really underscores how deeply our lifestyle choices are connected to the well-being of future generations. And it leads us to this question of inherited trauma. Could really difficult experiences, even those from, say, our grandparents' generation, could they leave a trace on our biology? Is that possible?
Well, some of the personal stories you gave me, they mentioned this thing called core language, which I gotta say sounds intriguing. How does that fit in with all of this, with inherited trauma?
Core language refers to the words and phrases that really resonate with us on a deep emotional level, often tied to our fears and anxieties. It's almost like a fingerprint, a verbal fingerprint of our deepest wounds.
So like if someone always feels trapped or like they're drowning, could that be like a clue? A clue pointing to some past trauma that's been passed down?
Exactly. By paying attention to that core language, we might uncover clues about traumas that have echoed through our families, for generations. And what's even more fascinating is the possibility that these deeply ingrained emotional patterns, they could be linked to changes in our genes, potentially through those epigenetic mechanisms we were talking about earlier.
Okay, so now we have this potential link between our experiences, our emotions, and actual changes in our genes. This is starting to paint a pretty complex picture.
It really is complex, isn't it? And it's not just limited to us humans either. We see evidence for this idea of, I think it's called social inheritance, even in the animal kingdom. For example, gorillas, when they're raised by humans, they often end up being pretty inept parents themselves. They don't have the skills to pass on to their young because they never learned them from their own parents.
So it's like they inherit not just their genes, but also behaviors, social patterns. Are there other examples of this social inheritance in the animal world?
Oh, definitely. There's research on rats, for instance, showing that if a parent is exposed to stress, their offspring, they inherit an elevated stress response. It's like the experience of stress gets passed down, like through the generations.
That's wild. This is really making me rethink, that whole nature versus nurture debate. It seems like our experiences, even our ancestors' experiences, can become a part of us. I mean, in a really tangible way.
It certainly challenges our traditional view of genes, like, the idea that genes are the sole directors of our destiny. It seems like there's this much more dynamic interplay going on between our genes and our environment, with experiences playing a really significant role. And speaking of genes, there's a particular type called imprinted genes that adds another layer to this whole story.
Imprinted genes. Okay, tell me more about those. How do they fit in?
They're fascinating because they're expressed differently depending on whether they come from the mother or the father. They play a crucial role in fetal development and placental growth, which means they could be a key part of how parental experiences, even before we're born, actually get encoded in our biology.
Wait, hold on a second. Are you suggesting that what my parents experienced, even before I was conceived, could have influenced my genes?
It's a possibility that researchers are actively exploring, yeah. Imagine, for example, a mother who's under a great deal of stress during pregnancy. It's possible that this could affect the expression of imprinted genes in her child, and that could lead to long-term consequences.
This is really challenging some of my assumptions about inheritance. I'm starting to think about my own family history in a whole new light now.
And it's not just about looking back, it's also about looking forward. If our experiences can shape how our genes express themselves, and even potentially be passed down, what does that mean for the choices we make today? What kind of legacy are we creating?
That is a big question, isn't it? But before we jump into that, I want to hear more about these imprinted genes and how they might connect with inherited trauma. Let's dive deeper into that in part 2 of this deep dive. See you soon.
Welcome back. It's really amazing to think about, isn't it, that something as complex as trauma could be passed down through generations, almost like this hidden inheritance.
It is, yeah. In part 1, we were talking about imprinted genes and how they might be involved in all of this. Can you remind us what makes these imprinted genes so unique? What sets them apart?
Sure. Imprinted genes, they're kind of like, those old family heirlooms, the ones that come with specific instructions to be opened by the mother's side only, or for the father's lineage to carry forward. Their genes were the expression. Whether they're turned on or off, it depends on which parent they came from.
So it's not just the gene itself, it's also like its origin story. Which side of the family it came from. That's wild. What kind of instructions are we actually talking about here?
Well, imprinted genes, they play a really big role in fetal development and placental growth. They're essential for making sure a baby develops in a healthy way.
Okay, but how does this all tie back into inherited trauma? Could a traumatic experience, could it actually change those instructions, the ones in the imprinted genes?
That's the million-dollar question. Researchers are still working on that, trying to put the pieces together. But let's imagine this scenario. Say a father goes through something really traumatic before conceiving a child. It's possible that this trauma could trigger epigenetic changes, maybe even affect those imprinted genes that he passes down to his kid.
So even if the child never experiences that trauma directly, they might still kind of inherit some of the fallout biologically through these imprinted genes.
That's the theory, yeah. It's like you toss a pebble in a pond, and the ripples, they keep spreading out. The impact of an event, even one from the past, it can be felt generations later. And, this is where things get even more interesting. We've been talking a lot about the science, but you also gave me those excerpts on ancient wisdom traditions. And they seem to have their own perspective on how our ancestors' experiences shape us.
Right. There's this concept of, carrying the burdens of our ancestors, which sounds a lot like what we're talking about, right? Inherited trauma. But what I find really interesting is that these traditions, they also offer ways to heal, ways to break free from these patterns. They emphasize rituals, ceremonies, working with altered states of consciousness, things like that.
It is fascinating. It's like these ancient practices, they were tapping into these concepts intuitively, long before we had the scientific tools to study them.
So what are these ancient approaches saying? How do we deal with this inherited baggage? Are we just stuck with it?
Not necessarily, no. Many of these traditions, what they focus on is bringing those subconscious patterns to light. Using rituals, ceremonies, and even working with altered states of consciousness, it's about making the unconscious conscious.
So it's about awareness then. Becoming aware of those patterns so we can make a choice about how we relate to them, like shining a light into those hidden corners of our mind where those ancestral influences might be hiding out.
Exactly. The idea is once we become conscious of those inherited influences, then we have the power to transform them. It's not about erasing the past, It's more about how do we integrate it into our present, into our future. And this idea, this concept of transformation through awareness, it actually aligns really well with some of the latest latest scientific research on brain plasticity, the idea that our brains, they can change, they can rewire themselves throughout our lives.
So it's not like we're stuck with this wiring that we inherited. We can rewire ourselves, break free from those inherited patterns that might be holding us back.
That's right. And this rewiring, it can happen through therapy, through self-reflection, and even through practices like mindfulness and meditation. These practices can help calm the nervous system, develop greater self-awareness, and ultimately, they can help us choose healthier ways of responding to life's challenges.
This is really making me think about my own life and my family history in a whole new way. It's pretty empowering to realize that we have more agency than we think. We can heal, we can grow, and we can even create a different legacy for ourselves and for future generations.
Absolutely. And it brings us to a really crucial point: the importance of creating a more positive legacy for the future. If we can heal our own trauma and make healthier choices, well, then we're not just benefiting ourselves, we're potentially impacting the well-being of our children, our grandchildren.
That's powerful. It's like we're breaking those chains of inherited trauma and creating a more positive ripple effect, one that goes way beyond our own lives.
Exactly. It's about responsibility, taking responsibility for our own healing, and becoming conscious creators, of a more loving, more compassionate world.
This deep dive, it's been truly transformative. We've explored this cutting-edge science, delved into those ancient wisdom traditions, and uncovered practical tools for healing and growth. What's your big takeaway from all of this? What stands out to you?
For me, it's this realization that we're not just products of our genes or our past experiences. We have this incredible capacity for transformation, for growth. And through awareness, conscious choices, and a commitment to healing, we can create a more positive legacy for ourselves and for the generations that come after us.
An inspiring message. It's a message of empowerment, of hope, and it really captures what the deep dive is all about: exploring the depths of knowledge and emerging with the renewed sense of what's possible.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I encourage you to reflect. Think about your own inherited patterns and consider what steps can you take today to heal and to create a more positive future. Remember, even the smallest actions can have a big impact.
It's been an honor diving deep with you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep believing in the power you have to create positive change. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. It's been a journey, hasn't it? Exploring this whole idea of epigenetics and inherited trauma. I mean, we've talked about the science, those imprinted genes, and even ancient wisdom traditions.
It has been quite a journey, and now in this final part, I think it's time to turn the focus to, well, to you, the listener. What can you actually do with all of this information? How can you apply these insights to your own life and experiences?
That's the key question, right? Because understanding the science is one thing, but using it to make a positive change, that's something else entirely. Where do we even begin? It feels kind of overwhelming.
Well, the first thing to remember always is that your genes, they're not your destiny. Even if you've inherited certain predispositions, you still have a say in how those genes express themselves.
So it's not about changing our DNA then, but about creating a better environment, an environment where our genes can thrive.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Think of it like gardening. You might inherit seeds with certain characteristics, but how you nurture those seeds, the soil, the sunlight, the water, all of that will ultimately shape how the plant grows.
Okay, I like that analogy. So what are some of the gardening tools we can use to cultivate healthier gene expression?
Your lifestyle choices are huge. What you eat, how much you move your body, how you manage stress, even the quality of your relationships, all of these things can impact how your genes express themselves.
So someone with a family history of, say, heart disease, they're not necessarily doomed to repeat that pattern.
Not at all. Genetics definitely plays a role. But your lifestyle choices, they can make a world of difference. A healthy diet, regular exercise, stress management techniques, these things create a more favorable environment, genetically speaking.
That's good to hear. It makes me feel like we have more control than we realize. But what about the trauma we inherit? Those emotional patterns, maybe even epigenetic changes passed down from our ancestors. What can we do to break free from those negative cycles?
Yeah.
How can we heal?
That's where things get a bit trickier, but there's definitely hope. Just like those ancient healing traditions we discussed, therapy and self-reflection, they can be powerful tools. They help us become aware of the patterns we've inherited and understand how they might be playing out in our lives.
It's about becoming conscious of those subconscious patterns, right? The ones that might be driving our behaviors, our reactions to things.
You got it. Once we bring those patterns into the light of awareness, we can start making different choices. learning new ways of responding to stress, building healthier relationships, even rewriting the whole narrative we tell ourselves about who we are, what we're capable of.
It sounds like a process of reclaiming our power,
Yeah.
on an emotional level and even on a biological level.
Exactly. And there's so many tools and techniques that can support you on that journey. Some people find traditional talk therapy helpful. Others resonate with somatic therapies, which focus on releasing trauma that's stored in the body. Practices like mindfulness, meditation, yoga, these can be transformative too.
It's like creating this personalized toolkit for healing, isn't it? Drawing from modern science and from ancient wisdom. And you mentioned earlier that even our social connections can play a role in gene expression. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. Our relationships, they have a huge impact on our well-being. Surrounding ourselves with supportive, loving people, it's like creating this positive feedback loop, a nurturing environment for our genes to express themselves in healthy ways. It's like we're all interconnected, and our collective well-being, it influences each other on a deeper level than we often realize.
That is a beautiful thought. So if we put all of this together, the science of epigenetics, those ancient traditions, the power of our choices, our relationships, what's the big takeaway? What does it all mean?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is this. You're not just a product of your past. You have the power to shape your present and your future. Not just for yourself, but for the generations that will come after you. By making conscious choices, nurturing your well-being, and fostering those loving connections, you can create a ripple effect of healing, one that extends far beyond your own life.
What an inspiring message. It really feels like we've been on this incredible journey together. We've explored the depths of science, those ancient wisdom traditions, and we've emerged with this renewed sense of hope, of possibility.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I encourage you to take a moment, reflect. What are some small steps you can take today, right now, to nurture your well-being, to create a more positive legacy for yourself and for future generations? Remember, even the smallest actions can make a world of difference.
It's been an honor diving deep with you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep believing in your power to make a difference, to create positive change. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.